Welcome all. I see some familiar faces and we have some people from all around the world, from US, from UK, from Turkey mostly. Welcome all. This is our parallel event within CSW'66. And our parallel event's name is Opportunities of Women Representation in the Context of Feminism. I will be moderating this event today and I'm so excited for it. So if it is okay for you, we can start with a brief introduction. And I tried to share my screen. Just a minute. Yeah. Can you see it? Is there any problem with it? Ah, okay, perfect. As I said, this is our parallel event, which is called Opportunities of Women Representation in the Context of Ecofeminism. First of all, I want to give a brief introduction of Hazar. Maybe you don't know what Hazar is. Hazar is a women NGO and it's an ECOSOC member. And it has established with a group of women whom aim is to empower women at 1993 as a group. But it became a legal NGO at 2006 in Turkey, Istanbul. And Hazar determines the current situation and problems of women and girls, tries to find solutions that will strengthen women's legal, social, political, and economic status, and works for the empowerment of women and girls. Currently, Hazar works on the social cohesion and education of refugee women and children, especially Syrian refugee women in Turkey, and supports women and girls socially and financially, works for the elimination of gender equality. This is a brief introduction of our NGO. As Hazar, we care women representation. At the picture, you see our board, and the board of Hazar consists of all women, and Hazar supports all forms of women representation in academia, in governmental level, in private sector, and so on. And as Hazar, we encourage diversity. I can say that Hazar embraces all women and girls, regardless of their race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, age, physical appearance, physical abilities, religious beliefs, political beliefs, or any other ideologies. And we work for ending gender equality in all areas and all forms of gender inequality. Hazar attends meetings, does researches, and develops policies and trainings for ending all forms of gender equality as a women's organization. Now, I would like to introduce our speakers for today. First of all, I would like to thank all of our speakers for being with us here today. First of all, Hilal Elver will be with us for the first presentation. She's an academic at different universities. She gives education at different universities. Secondly, Ülke Özeren will be with us for our presentation. She's a managing partner at Sustainability, Innovation and Management Consultancy. And the third speaker will be Jojo Mehta. And she's a co-founder and executive director of Stop Ecocide International. And I would like to give some details about our timeline. First, Hilal Elver will do her speech, her presentations about the effect of climate change on women. Secondly, Ülke Özeren will be with us to talk about the impact of women leaders in the context of environmental measures, especially in private sector. And then Jojo Mehta will be with us with her speech, Ecocide Law, Pioneering Legal Protection for the Earth. And then there will be a quick question and answer session. And lastly, it will be reserved for your suggestions and ideas. Thank you for you all for being with us today, tonight for Istanbul, this afternoon for US and other countries. And for now, I would like to give this speech to Hilal Elver for her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zeynep Hanım, and very pleased to be together with one of the events of the Hazar Foundations. Over the years, I have been continuously visiting the foundation, and we had a very good cooperation with our respective works, and congratulations to you all. This is a very important area that Hazar Foundation took initiative and make this much more kind of little bit educative, little bit of more PR doing in Turkey in relation to the role of women and climate change and many other global issues. So let me start first my talk as a citation or quotation from the UN Secretary General. A couple of days ago, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, during the opening session of the Commission on the Status of Women, told, and I quote, unprecedented emergencies of the climate crisis, pollution, desertification, and biodiversity loss, coupled with the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact of new and ongoing conflicts have accelerated and intensified into widespread and interlinked crises that affect us all. And he continued, everywhere women and girls face the greatest threat and the deepest harm. When climate disasters strike, as they do with increasing frequency, research shows that women and children are up to 14 times more likely than men to die, unquote. Starting from the Secretary General's focus on climate change, natural disaster, and its impact on rural women in his opening speech, especially he focused on least developed countries and developing countries, the role of the women in the agricultural sector, which is very important. I like to particularly emphasize in this talk on women and girls who are in agricultural and food sector, mainly live areas that disaster prone and affected disproportionately by climate emergencies, while they have no contribution to this existential threat to our survival. So gender and climate change, what is the connection? Let's take extreme weather events among the many impacts of climate change, such as sea level rise, ocean acidification, water scarcity, and so on and so forth. We know all from our lives. 80% of the extreme weather events are directly related to climate change. In recent years, there is an incredible amount of the multiplication of the natural disasters we are experiencing. And those extreme weather events, such as drought and floods, result growing food and water insecurity that disproportionately affects the world's 1.3 billion poor, the majority of whom, the 70% of the poor, are women. So women and girls worldwide already face many inequalities that are embedded in social practices and laws, such as patriarchal norms constraining their access to resources and affecting their lives and livelihoods. It is widely acknowledged that climate change impacts are not gender neutral. As already marginalized individuals in virtually every society, women face discrimination and are subject to human rights abuses at a disproportionate rate, further accelerated by climate change. Women in rural areas are particularly affected as the number of female-headed households continues to grow, exceeding 30% in some developing countries, while women own only in some countries 2%, this go to 14 to 20% of agricultural land and have limited access to productive resources, which means land ownership is depending on different part of the world. It could be as little as 2%, as unfortunately as big as 20%. That's a big kind of discrimination. This is not only affects rural women, but also affects entire world everywhere. According to FAO, women are responsible for 50% of the world's food production, most of which is for family consumption. I am focusing on these days the food consumption and the food insecurity, knowing that right now we are having significant kind of food crisis. Now it started in the COVID-19, and now we are experienced because of the ongoing war in Ukraine. So that's a very important thing, because most of the rural women are the producers of what we are consuming in our cities. So that makes completely connected our life with the rural women's conditions. In addition to many challenges they face, women have significant barriers in tackling climate change because of their gender. Their vulnerability to climate change-related risk is exacerbated by discriminatory practices in the agricultural sector, where gender discrimination may affect women's access to financing, technical support, and other necessary resources. They may also have less bargaining power in or be excluded from decision-making on land use or preparedness and adaptation strategies that you are focusing in this talk about the decision-making and women's agency. Let's focus on natural disaster and risk management, because this is a very important area in coming years and last few years that we are experiencing. In times of natural disaster, women's household responsibilities increase while access to resources decreases. The daily work involved in providing food, water, and fuel for households after a disaster requires intensive labor, the bulk of which is borne by women. In many rural areas, women and girls spend the majority of their time engaged in subsistence farming and the collection of water and fuel. As a result of disasters, this task became more time-consuming. The impact on the traditional division of roles tended to intensify, making the workload of women even greater in a country where women already work up to 16 hours a day. We're talking about significant amount of hours and mostly undocumented and outside of regular economic system. This in turn decreases the time available for food production and preparation and threatens women's health and safety, with consequences for household food security and nutritional well-being. Of course, also it affects all households that women are basically caregivers to children and elderly. Impacts of decreased water quality as a result of disaster, which is very important in disasters area, also gender differentiated. Women are more physically vulnerable to waterborne diseases due to their role in supplying household water and responsibility for domestic chores. Decreased water resources may also cause women's health to suffer as a result of increased work burden and reduced nutritional status. It's also important to highlight the fact that climate change itself intensifies psychological stress associated with disasters, increasing women's risk of situation of violence, sexual harassment, and trafficking. Because women are forced into prostitution, increased HIV prevalence exists in drought-ridden areas of most part of the world. Women in refugee camps or in situations where they are internally displaced experience particular vulnerabilities. As you work as a Hazar Foundation with the migration cases, you have to see in the first hand all these problems. Women cannot easily flee disaster or dangerous areas when they are pregnant, responsible for children and elderly people, or restrained by social mores that inhibit their presence in public spaces or demand restrictive dress. If they do escape the immediate disaster, women are vulnerable to abuse in camps for refugees or internally displaced persons, including increased risk of sexual and gender-based violence, unequal access to training and economic opportunities, and little or poor reproductive health care. Pre-existent patterns of discrimination against women in these areas is intensified, diminishing women's rights to housing, land, and property. All kinds of human rights are abused in this kind of situation. Although women are forced to bear the brunt of the consequences of climate change, they have been systematically excluded from decision-making mechanism and denied agency in deciding when and how to overcome the vulnerability they face. Despite such ongoing exclusion, women are contributing to both adaptation and mitigation efforts in many parts of the world, and they are creating innovative and localized solutions to build resilient communities. At all levels of leadership and across all sectors of society, women's representation is not an option, but necessary. It is increasingly evident that involvement of women in all decision-making processes on climate action is a significant factor in meeting the climate challenge and achieving the long-term objectives of the climate policies in local, national, and global level. So why women involvement is important? Women work 2/3 of the world's working hours, produce half the world's food, and earn 10% of the world's income. In other words, women and other subsistence or essential workers constitute the forces of reproduction or earth care labor, who through their daily work practices take care of the conditions for human reproduction and thus are keeping the world alive. Especially in developing countries, women are predominantly responsible, as I said, food production, household water supply, and energy for heating and cooking. As climate change impacts increase in recent years, these tasks are becoming more difficult. However, based on several scientific researches, women have knowledge and coping strategies that give them a practical understanding of innovation and skills to adapt to changing environmental realities, as well as to contribute to the solutions. These strategies to deal with climate variability, especially in local levels, are still largely untapped resources. Unfortunately, solutions for climate change has been, for the most part, traditionally constructed as a technical and scientific phenomena that principally warranted technical responses and simply excluded from women ingenuity. As well, all know that ongoing stereotype against women involvement in scientific work is a fact and is still continuing problem in the climate change science. Additionally, women are often faced with difficulties when it comes to the general accessibility of financial resources, capacity building activities, and technologies, as their property rights and tenure are significantly limited compared to men. This often stands in the way of women's empowerment in general and their role in relation to climate change adaptation and mitigation particularly. Women also tend to be underrepresented in the decision-making process, especially in the climate change policies at all levels. This severely limits their ability to contribute and implement solutions and apply their expertise. The successful implementation of climate change policies and projects requires an understanding of the gender-based roles and relationship vis-a-vis natural resources, as well as the gender-differentiated impact of climate change. The Beijing Declaration in 1995 was the first international declaration to recognize the link between gender equality and climate change. Actually, it was very early period to make this connection. Surprisingly, it was a forward-looking document, still it is. It took a long time for international climate change policymakers to address gender dimensions of climate change. Despite since 1995, women organizations are pushing the role of the climate change and gender discrimination, the role of the woman. But the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is a very traditional international law document, referred to gender consideration only in one indirect part, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation and response measures. And call women, referring to women as a vulnerable group. In recent years, progress has been made slightly and slowly in integrating gender inequality in the COP decision. COP means conference or the parties with every year UN framework convention is continuing. The last one was the Glasgow. As a result, for a long time, gender was completely absent in the UN Framework Convention. When it was first written, immediately following the UN Conference on Environment and Development, which is 1992 in Rio, there was no connection whatsoever. Only in 2015, in Paris Climate Agreement, which has replaced the Kyoto Agreement of the Climate Change Convention, they put women's rights and women empowerment in the preamble, not the regular procedural article. So it's only kind of let's say formal or normative principles in the preamble. As of today, just 1/3 of decision-making roles under the Framework Convention on Climate Change are occupied by women, while they account for only 15% of environment ministers. Moreover, only 1/3 of 192 national energy frameworks include gender consideration, and they are rarely considered in climate financing. This demonstrates one more that we live in a male-dominated world with a male-dominated culture. Those words are not mine. Those words are the UN Secretary General. And I quote again, a millennium of patriarchy that excludes women and prevents their voices from being heard. We cannot realize any of our goals without the contribution of all, including men and boys, working for women's rights and gender equality. That is a very strong statement by the UN Secretary General. The first time, actually. Always Secretary General works about the women issues, but never been able to become Secretary General since the United Nations was established. So high-level decision-making positions are still belong to men, and some men recognize the role of the women. That's the kind of way we have to go further. For instance, one good thing, for instance, UN Environment UNEP, UN Environment Program, which is executive director is woman, Swedish parliamentarian, Inger Andersson. And she said, enough a male-dominated solution. That's in reinvigorating environmental multilateralism, she said that it is critical that women be put at the heart of decision-making. However, the system still needs to incorporate a human rights approach, including participatory monitoring system to evaluate standards, as well as mechanism to seek remedy for violation of human rights, particularly for women. A human rights approach emphasizes local self-determination that frustrated by externally imposed ownership and promotes control over critical and traditional local resources like water, land, and biodiversity. Let me stop here, and I'm happy to get your questions to be able to answer, hopefully. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you so much for this valuable speech. I would like to mention some points because I think that these are the most important points of the speech. You mentioned a lot of things like discrimination, disadvantage of women, and some male-dominated areas in the context of environmental measures and environmental issues. You said that women are responsible from food production and water supply, but on the other hand, they get affected from natural disasters as well as climate change more than men. And only 1/3 of women can find a chance to attend decision-making processes about environmental issues. I think that's a huge problem. And you also said that women representation is not an option, but a necessity. And this is a motto for me for this event. Thank you so much for your attendance and all your speech. It was a valuable speech to me. For this presentation, we can take questions because she has a lecture after that event, so she has to leave. If you have questions, you can answer. I am letting you the speech.
By the way, I would like to listen also our dear friend Jojo Mehta's presentation, so I'm going to keep it myself to listen to her because it's very valuable for me. Thank you.
Dear participants, do you have any questions? You can ask it from the chat as well. I can read it from there.
May I just say something?
Sure.
I'm delighted. Firstly, I'm delighted to be here, and I must apologise for having arrived a little bit late due to a time zone mix-up. I'm in England, and also to acknowledge all the other speakers, and particularly it's with great pleasure that I've been listening to you speak, Hilal. And I've read quite a bit about you, and I'm so excited to be in sharing a platform with you. Looking forward also to Orko's contribution. This has been an incredible, just from what I've heard, even just in the last 10 minutes of what Hilal said, it's almost a kind of a roll call of everything that needs addressing. And it's interesting how, how much of this discrepancy is still there. And I wonder, Hilal, what I'm feeling something around how women sort of how we sort of get women more involved in decision-making positions. And I wonder if you had an opinion about the approach on doing that, because my sense is that there is still a bit of an expectation that if women are going to sort of ascend, if you like, into these positions of decision-making power, that they somehow have to approach it in a way that men would approach it. And so there's almost a kind of one of the feelings that I've had of frustration in reading the recent IPCC report and also coming out of COP26 last year is that it feels very much to me like we're all, or rather the great and good, are all trying to sort of play the same game, but do it a bit better. So, let's try and sort of, include an extra woman here or there. Let's try to reduce our emissions a bit here or there. And actually what's really required is something completely different. And the fact that the women are actually on the ground at the core of looking after the living planet seems to me to be a really important place to look. And yeah, I was just really interested in whether you had any comments about that.
Well, thank you very much, Jojo. First of all, it's a great pleasure to hear you in this platform. Well, it's very interestingly enough, still we have this kind of historical feelings about participation of women. And it seems to be like, especially when I when I talk about the women empowerment, I don't like the words the women empowerment. It seems to be like somebody should empower you to do more things. So women's rights are more important. And also in UN conversation and in my reports, I always make this point. Human rights-based approach is very important because human rights-based approach gives a woman agency. You represent yourself as a woman, not as a mother, not as a caretaker. You cannot have to be somebody. Just being a woman, you have a right. So basically, in many traditional societies, the right of position of women is considered in the family and also considered as a mother. But the role of women or caretaker, the caretaker is a so important issue in the world. The women are basically working no payment. I mean, in the UN report, again, is trying to make this point that women's role and participation in the working environment is significantly invisible. So again, the COP26, yes, they put in the Paris Agreement women's rights and indigenous people's rights, these two. And generally, women's role also in the indigenous community together, certain kind of intersectionality, which means you are not only women, also indigenous people. So you have to be protected doubly, having these two different, let's put adjective. Unfortunately, basically all these rules and principles that happen in Glasgow, it's just words, and they put here and there. We acknowledge the role of the women, we acknowledge the role of the indigenous people, but they stop acknowledging their land rights. So land rights are important. If you don't give a specific result of the women's participation, there's no point. So of course you would say this is a global kind of platform, and the governments and states also have to make their changes in their law. Most of the governments change in their law. Some of them are even way earlier than last 20, 30 years. For instance, this is example for Turkey. For instance, inheritance law changed since 1926, and women's participation into the political life, right to vote in 1930s. But if you look at the reality, these laws were not easily implemented. Still in 2022, we have to look at the parliamentarians, how many women are sitting there. So that's the implementation part. So it is an important to push these principles in every platform, but implementation and basically monitoring by women. If we look at from the human rights perspective, then we can see the human rights rules gives you a possibility to monitoring what is going on. So it's a very important thing. Again, like women inclusion was so late in climate change, human rights inclusion also very late. If you go sit there climate change meetings, which I was participating as a Turkish government's committee many years in this climate change meetings, but these people that comes to discuss climate change, they have no clue about human rights. When you talk about the human rights, environment ministers, finance ministers have no clue. They said, oh, no, we're not talking about human rights here. We are not in Geneva. We are here dealing with the climate change. If you look at this interconnected problems of the global world from only one side, We will never be able to solve this. That's why I like the Secretary General's talk, which I quote generally. I don't quote Secretary General's speech, but he said interlinked crisis. That's the very important point. We cannot solve one problem without solving the another. So everything is interconnected. So human rights gives us this kind of connectivity if we can make it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hilal Hanım. I guess we have another question from Aslı Öztürk. She's asking, adding to Jojo's question, how can we enhance women interest to this issue, especially our members?
Yeah, there are lots of recommendations in our report. You know, every report you can look at about women's empowerment, right of women. There are many, many recommendations. Of course, these recommendations, how should be realized? That's the problem. So basically, you have to recognize the role of women. In order to recognize the role of women, you should give plenty of space to NGOs and civil society organizations, because this is the way our voice should be heard, because we cannot go directly local communities bringing the leaders to the big global platform. So you have to find out and empower women organizations, for instance, financially, legally. They have to really promote by states. Many of the European countries actually promote some civil society organizations to be part of this discussion. That's a very important thing. Same thing have to be in everywhere. Of course, this needs a democratic system. If you are in the democratic system, the civil society's role becomes important, because they will be there, they will be existed, they will be financially supported, and they will be heard. So that's the one important thing. And also the policymakers actively should make a cooperation with this women organization, grassroots organization, everyone. They should ask, because women's kind of practical solutions sometimes is more important than big scientific results. So all of the kind of women organizations should be cooperated as a decision-making mechanism, but in a normal way. It's not something, for instance, we talk about marginalized voices should be brought into central parts of the UN Framework Convention. We always say this in the recommendation, but this must be meaningful participation, not just a window dressing, which happened in last Glasgow meeting, exactly happened like that. Indigenous, as I said, indigenous communities were acknowledged, but not recognize their land rights. Same thing for women. So the also process will be transparent and inclusive. Whoever will be part of this kind of policies, open to public, not the pick and choose. Oh, I like this organization, I will invite this, but I don't like that organization because they are politically sitting in the left or sitting in the right. You know, we always do this. Decision makers and politicians make the civil society choices based on their ideological setting. That's also wrong. It has to be open to everyone. So all these things that important, and the climate also civil society organizations have to make some kind of educational programs to make people much more kind of understanding the situation, understanding the problems, and understanding their rights. So both of them, you have to know the problems and you have to know your rights, and you have to know how to act, how to ask this, how to access to justice. Oh, access to justice is very important. If you have a good justice system, access to justice is good. But if you don't have an objective, democratic, and workable justice system, then it's not going to work again. So everything is connected. We need a democratic society. We need a good education. We need a financial help that would be kind of widely accepted by entire community, including men and young boys, because they have to work together. Without, you cannot really make on your own, because you are only 50%. So that's an important kind of cooperation with the young generation, especially.
Thank you for your answer, and thank you for your time, your speech, your answers again. And now I would like to say something about Terry. Terry is here from CSW Committee of Trinidad and Tobago, and she agrees with Hilal Hanım, and she says that a human rights approach is the best way to have these interconnected issues. For now, I would like to leave the floor to Ülke Özeren for her speech about the impact of women leaders in the context of environmental measures. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zeynep Hanım. So before reflecting my presentation, first of all, I'd like to thank to your foundation for this invitation, and for me joining this very valuable platform is very important. So it's an honor for me to share this platform also with Hilal Hanım and Jojo. So I'm very pleased to be here. So thank you very much for very, very valuable and informative speech, Hilal Hanım. Thank you very much. So very nice to meet you also. So I'll just share my presentation right now. Just a minute. Okay. Yes. So I think it's on the screen right now. You can see, and you can easily see, I think. Okay. Yeah, so I'll just present myself. I'll just go through very quickly. And I'll start with a sustainable definition of a woman leader. It's a very well-known definition of sustainability. Maybe most of the presentations are starting with this definition. And I'll talk about women leaders influencing sustainability in the world. And I found a very nice article of World Economic Forum. So I'll just pick some takeaways of the study. So I'll just mention on this, and I'll do a very brief conclusion. I'm Ülke. I'm an environmental professional since 1997. I worked many projects in different positions. So I just established my company with my, again, woman colleague, Hatice, this year. We are just newly born company for the sustainability. Okay. So this is, this definition I think very well of Gro Harlem Brundtland. She says that was sustainability. Sustainability meets the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generation to meet their needs. So in 1987, she quoted this, she made this definition for sustainable world. And for the women leader, I'd like to start with Ursula von der Leyen. Since when she became the president in December 2019, just launched the European Green Deal, really very ambitious program or law, I can say, to push the European continent being the zero climate neutral continent by 2050. So she lists this very successfully, I believe. So I wanted to start with Ursula von der Leyen. So I found out women leaders in the world. This is a Times study, and it starts with Christina Figueres. She is ex-executive secretary of UNFCCC, and she acted at that position between 2010 to 2016. She successfully steered world leaders to reach the Paris Agreement in 2015, and she pointed out gender dimension of climate change. And she is the author of The Future We Choose, Surviving the Climate Crisis book. And she describes the world needs to do in the next 10 years to combat with climate change. So Rihanna Gunright, she grew up in Inglewood in the south side of Chicago, where the local population suffer from asthma because of pollution. Maybe her sensitivity over these climate issues raised from this point. And in the mid-2010s, Rihanna Gunright realized how the environment shapes a wide range of social justice issues. And then her journey for combating with climate change has begun. She worked with Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez as an author of the Green New Deal in US, and she was in charge of developing strategies to pitch the bold climate plan. And she is now climate policy director at the Roosevelt Institute. And the other leader is Kate Rachel. In the lead up to the September 2019 UN Climate Change Summit, she has played an influential role leading the UN Secretary General's push for countries and companies to make new commitments to expedite the energy transition. As the leader of the World Bank's climate program, Kate developed strategies to make hundreds of billions of dollars available to developing countries eager to address climate change, but lacking the resources. And now she is Dean of the Fletcher School of Tufts University, and she's currently leads a nonprofit Sustainable Energy for All that seeks to bring energy to underdeveloped places while also helping them move away from fossil fuels. And she says, we have to make sure we take care of everybody. And the other women leader on sustainability, I can say, Kate Marvel. In blog posts, tweets, and podcasts, Kate Marvel cuts through misinformation about climate change with storytelling. In 2013, as a postdoctoral researcher, Marvel had discovered that human activity has almost definitely changed global rainfall patterns. Today, she's an associate research scientist at NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies at Columbia University, where she's recently partnered with colleagues to study climate models and tree rings, and discovered that climate change has been affecting droughts since 19. And the other is, as you know very well, Greta Thunberg. Although there were speculations over her, I think she's a very important character among youth activism. After then, many youth groups started for activism on against climate change. And she says that I'm not planning to stop this movement, and I don't think anyone else is either. Sorry. Hindo Ömer Ibrahim, she is an indigenous activism, and from the Moboro pastoralist community in Chad. She has spent last 10 years working to bridge the gap between the international decisions on climate change with the reality on the ground, she says. And she says, I want to tell people what it is like in my country. So leading up to the historic 2015 climate change meetings in Paris, she was a key leader among indigenous groups that successfully lobbied to have their rights recognized, and she was selected to speak at the signing ceremony of the accords. And the article that I found from that was prepared by World Economic Forum, I'll just share the study that placed in this report. And this study was done by Zenger Folkman in 2020. And this study shows this competences, women outscored men on most leadership competences. And according to this study, we can see the differences, main differences, why women are better than at what competences according to the against men, let's say. And at that points, taking initiatives, learning agility, inspiring and motivating others, developing others, building relationships, displaying high integrity and honesty, communicating powerfully and prolifically, collaboration and teamwork, champions change, making decisions, driving for results, values diversity and establish stretch goals, points, women are better than men. So I just pick out some notes from leader that takes in this study. One is Sarah Chen. She is the $1 billion fund for women, co-founder and managing partner. And she says that women's leadership is not only key in building sustainability and inclusive future, but transformational. We need to celebrate the full spectrum of leadership styles that women bring, which will lift us all up. And the other women leader take place in this study is Victoria Lason Perez, Chris Chip Safer, founder and CEO. And she says that there are 3 big evils in this world: corruption, mediocrity, and bad leadership. We need to start choosing better leaders, no matter the gender. The other woman in this study was Dr. Nima Kazije, and she's a surgeon. She says that women and children are the most vulnerable groups that are exposed to the consequences of climate change. The exclusion of those most affected means missed opportunities for adequately understanding challenges, and more importantly, it means solutions that are developed are unlikely to be effective and are unlikely to be sustainable over time. So this is what also Hilal Hanım says for the in her speech. So the other women leader says, Dr. Marga Kual Soler, founder and again CEO. Research shows a clear linkage between women's leadership and pro-environmental outcomes. Also, women's leadership style also favors long-term thinking, collaboration, transparency, and inclusion. So as I conclude all of these, I can say that the ambitious and courageous voice of such inspiring women leaders demonstrate the unique position of women as stewards of natural resources. The distinctive insight and strong decision-making skills brought in by women leaders is key to their role as a driving force for a sustainable future and real gender equality. With the increasing representation of women in political arena and in business, greater value creation for the society is inevitable. For sustainable solutions, women is must, not nice to have, as Hilal Hanım also mentions in her speech. And as Dr. Marga Kual Soler says, women's leadership style also favors long-term thinking, collaboration, transparency, and inclusion. So that's all from my side, and I'm very happy for any questions, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ülke Hanım, for your nice presentation. It was a lovely presentation, I think, and I have some points to emphasize about your presentation. First of all, it was a pleasure to listen about women leaders working on sustainability and climate change. I didn't know that there are a lot of women working on this issue, and I have some notes about their names. I remember Kate Marvel, who is producing podcasts to fight misinformation about climate change. I think for this digital age, it's really important to produce podcasts, some, I don't know, contents for social media to share information and fight with misinformation about climate change. I think we all know Greta Thunberg. She's very popular nowadays. And the third name is Hindu or Hinda. I don't remember. I think I wrote wrong. I think it was lovely to see a woman from indigenous community, Hindu, sorry, from indigenous community, because I believe that we all see a lot of women from Western societies or bigger countries, communities, societies, but seeing all those women coming from indigenous communities is very important to me. And this information was really important to me. Women outscored men on most leadership competencies. I think this is significant to see the importance of women leadership, especially on climate change and sustainability. Again, thank you for your presentations. By the way, if you have any questions or comments about Ülke Hanım's presentation, you can ask your questions after Jojo's speech at our Q&A session. Thank you. And now this is time for Jojo Mehta. By the way, do I pronounce your name correctly? Is it Jojo or Jojo?
It's usually Jojo, but obviously it's often people pronounce differently in different countries. So in Spain, sometimes I'm Jojo, and in Germany, Yo-Yo, and in French, Jojo. So it varies a lot, but I say it Jojo.
Okay, then I'm going to pronounce it as Jojo. Actually, J is pronouncing as a J in Turkish, so I call it Jojo. Sorry about the mispronunciation.
Fine, it's fine.
So I'm leaving the floor to you. Thank you for your attendance.
Oh, thank you so much. And I'm sure we will have more questions coming back to Oku later. So this is actually quite an unusual speaking context for me, the context of the status of women, and thinking about that in relation to what I do and to what our organization and our growing global movement is calling for. Bear with me a second. So that's my daughter trying to call me. She can talk to me later. So when I look at our work through this particular lens, then there are actually a number of things that come into focus. And I suppose perhaps I should start firstly by thanking you very much for inviting me to this forum, which is a real honor. And secondly, to perhaps give a little introduction as to what it is that I do and what we do at Stop Ecocide International. Which is the organization which I'm a key spokesperson for and a co-founder of. We focus very specifically on criminalizing mass harm to nature, or ecocide. In other words, we really have a very sort of almost surgically precise goal, which is to criminalize ecocide at the international level. So to add ecocide to the list of international crimes. Currently, obviously, those are genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression. And I think it's probably important to just say a couple of words about how this movement is really growing, accelerating at present. We had a couple of very key milestones last year because our foundation convened a panel of international lawyers to draw up a legal definition of ecocide, which was very well received in both by the media and in political circles. And the beauty of this definition is that it's so concise that it fits on a business card. and ecocide is defined as unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. Now, we see this movement, this particular strategic legal initiative, as a way of legally framing the action that can be taken around climate change. Because as I was mentioning briefly when Hilal and I was speaking, the sense coming out of of COP26, of the recent IPCC report, is that action around the world is not happening fast enough and also not happening effectively enough. And I think Hilal outlined a number of the reasons why that could be the case. But I think this, again, comes down to this sense that we have that, you know, it's no good trying to play the same game better. We need to play it differently. And in the same way as, you know, perhaps real change doesn't necessarily happen by women approaching a male-dominated sphere in the way a man would do, that perhaps, you know, we acknowledge that there may be different ways of approaching this. And I'll come back to that because one of the key aspects of what we hope to achieve with criminalizing harm to nature speaks very strongly to how both women and the earth have been treated for many centuries, and particularly in the Western paradigm that is now dominating our global political and economical life. So we aim specifically for the International Criminal Court for a number of reasons. I mean, one is that it's the only legal mechanism globally that accesses the criminal justice systems of all its member states. So it's a complementary court. It's not a separate court like the Court of Human Rights or the Inter-American Court, for example. If you make something a crime, if your country ratifies a crime there, it must include it in its own domestic legislation. So it's a practical way of creating a coherent new ground rule that, you know, that applies across borders. And of course, that's very important with destruction of the environment, because often it's big transnational corporations that are at play in that arena. And of course, they have the capacity to operate in different jurisdictions according to, you know, how lax or how strict the regulations might be. Another reason is that aiming at the international level is a way of building solidarity, because rather than, and it's not that we wouldn't encourage people to try to legislate nationally, but to do so internationally, it requires collaboration. It requires many states to get behind this. And in doing so, it also takes a certain amount of time. Not a huge amount, and we don't have a huge amount of time, as we know from the situation that we're in globally, but some time is required in order for the many different corporate and industrial sectors to change their practices in alignment with the law that they can see approaching. So that's really important. But then the third reason is really what for me ties in with the theme of ecofeminism. And that is that when we put destruction of nature alongside destruction of people, in other words, when we put ecocide alongside genocide, what we're saying is actually quite profound. What we're saying is that damage to the natural world around us is equally serious and equally important as damage to people. And of course, what we see in that, in the need for that balancing, for bringing that element into play, is in order to rebalance a kind of sense of dualism and separation that our entire sort of globally dominant culture has developed over many centuries. You know, the whole kind of division. I mean, even if you go back to Greek thought and you look at, you know, Plato's ideal versus real, and then you look at the many centuries that were dominated globally by the Catholic way of thinking, where spirit is put in opposition to body, and then you move forward to the Enlightenment, where yes, you know, perhaps, you know, God is replaced by reason, but the dualism remains. You still have the rational versus the emotional. You have the mind versus the body, or man versus nature, or as the dominating force around nature. So this kind of constant separation is there throughout the history of Western thinking, and it has come to dominate so strongly that we consider ourselves separate to the world around us. And I think the reflection of how we treat the planet, which is the life-giving world of nature, and how we treat women culturally, there are certainly parallels there. And of course, the ecofeminist movement has a strong comments on that. But I think it's really interesting from the perspective of what we're doing in terms of wanting to bring a new criminal law into being, a new parameter that is actually an enforceable framework to protect the natural living world, is a step towards perhaps breaking down that alienation a bit between those, those man and nature, and it often has been man and nature rather than woman and nature. So to actually sort of rebalance that in some way is I think a really, really important aspect. And another thing to mention is that this is a movement that is led by women. It was co-founded by myself and Polly Higgins, and probably worth mentioning a little bit about the history of that. Polly Higgins was a Scottish barrister working in London and becoming very successful in her cases around employment law. But she looked out of the window in the Royal Courts of Justice in London after winning a case and said to herself, it's not just my clients that need a lawyer, it's actually the earth that needs a lawyer. And the question that she said to herself was, how do we create a legal duty of care for the earth? And that speaks back to the association that is sort of profoundly embedded, and of course in many ways correct, of women as the givers of life and the caretakers. And how do we look after the earth? How do we look after what gives life? And she began very much in the rights sphere, looking at rights of nature and the universal rights of Mother Earth. She was very much part of that conversation in South America when that was being had in around 2009. But what she realized is that our rights are protected by crimes. And when I say crimes, I mean crimes in law. So effectively, our basic human right is a right to life. But that right is protected by the fact that to kill us is a crime. If we didn't have the crime of murder enshrined in law, then it would be much harder to protect our right to life. And so that's why she ended up working specifically on this concept of criminalizing at the global level, criminalizing destruction of nature. And what she found is that actually that conversation had already been happening in the 1990s, but it never quite made it to the Rome Statute, the treaty that formed the International Criminal Court. And so she saw really the sort of mission of her life as replacing that missing crime. And we began working together in 2014. And, my sort of entry into this was very much from an on-the-ground activist background. I was very involved in the anti-fracking community in the UK. And that's how I got to know Polly. And it was also interesting that sort of impulse to start working in kind of on-the-ground activism and making a difference, whether it was giving speeches, talking to politicians, making legal interventions, came from my daughter, who heard me talking about fracking and said, "Mummy, I don't understand." She burst into tears and she said, "Mummy, I don't understand. If they're poisoning the ground, surely they're poisoning themselves. You have to tell them to stop." And when I said to her, "I don't know how much difference it will make if I just call one of these big companies," she said, "There must be someone you can talk to. Can't you talk to the voting man?" And she meant our local elected member of parliament. And she was only 5. And this really speaks to what Hilal was talking about earlier, about how important the democratic representation is. But when I had a conversation with that politician, what I found is that every question I asked, he sidestepped and kind of refused to answer my questions straight. And I remember coming out of that meeting thinking, that is the last time that is going to happen. I'm going to inform myself and ensure that I'm never put in that position again. And so the sort of thing I'm bringing up with that is that the route into what I am now engaged in was very personal. And it was very rooted in actually my own feelings for the protection of my daughter's future. And I think that there is something that is interesting. I did some research as a student, actually, and I spoke to a woman in Italy who had previously been on the European Commission. And I said to her, would you say from your experience that if there were more women in decision-making positions, would there still be the same degree of conflict in the world? And she said, absolutely not. In her experience, there would be far less conflict, and particularly far less armed conflict, if there were more women in positions of power and positions of decision making. So I find it really interesting that actually this movement, and it's not just us by any means. When my close colleague Polly passed away, we had an interesting situation, because I think sometimes this happens with movements that have a very strong figurehead. People sometimes sit back and say, I don't need to do this because Polly's doing it. And then when she was no longer there, as her close colleague, I had a lot of people approach us saying, well, we really want to make sure this work continues. How can we help? And what was really interesting about that was to find out how many connections, how many other politicians, campaigners, lawyers, diplomats were actually interested in this. And so becoming, bringing this into more the global sphere and across different levels of civil society, what we discovered was that there were so many dots to be joined. And so this is very much a story of collaboration. And what we often found was that those who were already working in the space were often women. So Valerie Cabanas in France, Pelatil in Sweden, Kate McIntosh in the US. I mean, lots of women who were very interested in this movement. And we found that we do have some men on our team, and the ones we have are amazing. But it is often women who really understand and sort of almost instantly get why this is an important thing to put in place. And I think it's becoming now, and it's what's perhaps tragic and also perhaps human, is that I think we have culturally a bit of a tendency, or perhaps it's even more ingrained than that, to take seriously what we can see right in front of us. And what we're now seeing, of course, globally is becoming ever more obvious with regard to the climate situation and to ecological breakdown. And of course, over the last couple of years, it's become ever more clear and discussed that these issues are not separate, that they are intertwined, that the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, human rights issues, and issues of gender, all of these things are actually intertwined, which is again something that Hilal already brought up. And I think just a little example of perhaps what might be looked at as a different approach to agency, and this is something as well that was brought up earlier, could perhaps be thought of as a feminine approach. I mean, I always feel slightly reluctant to sort of pigeonhole particular things, but what I would certainly observe about how we work, for example, is that we work very much as a collaboration, and our whole approach is very connective and inclusive and non-confrontational. And that's partly because we have such a broad audience, from activists on the ground at one hand to ambassadors at the other. So we have to be able to be all inclusive in our language, and that can sometimes be quite interesting. So that's one aspect. But also, one of the things that we've discovered is that when we've just kind of begun to get to the stage with this movement where more established figures in global politics, in law, in academia, are really taking serious notice of this. And we've always been in a position that the developments behind the scenes at the diplomatic level are actually much further ahead than people can see publicly. So it's only now getting to the stage in a way where there's enough awareness for more established figures to be getting in touch, to be commenting. And one of the things that's quite interesting is that we sometimes encounter the sort of thing where somebody will say, you're mixing everything up. How are you? How does it work that you're mixing up civil society and law and politics and the corporate world? Why don't you keep the law for the lawyers the politics for the politicians, and you know, the NGO discourse is a separate one. And we sort of, and we find this amazing, because actually what we realize is that the way that this conversation has moved ahead so fast is precisely because we have not done that. It's precisely because we have created connections between different sectors of society, but also different levels. And what we've discovered is that where the conversation is happening at grassroots level and within civil society, we're also seeing the political dial moving, and we're also seeing then, you know, the corporate world coming in as well and saying, well, we're interested in this because, you know, as investors, for example, we want some stability in what we can expect from projects in the future in the context of a global emergency. And so we're actually ending up connecting both people and communities, if you like, different types of communities in this conversation to the broadest extent that we can. And what we're finding is that the response that we're getting is really, people are really interested, and they're really interested in how this new legal framing of saying that, you know, threatening severe harm to the environment is a crime, how that can affect their particular, what they're doing in their particular life and in their particular sector, for example. So that's been very, it's been both educational for us, but it's been interesting to see how practical that's been in the world in terms of moving it forward. I also think it's interesting that ultimately it will be governments that have to decide to criminalize harm to nature at the international level, which is what we're aiming for. And that the first head of state to speak in support of this conversation was a woman. And that was the Right Honourable Fiame Naomi Mataafa of Samoa, who spoke at our event at the International Criminal Court in December, where we presented the definition of ecocide in the audience for which it was intended, which was the Assembly of States Parties there. And that conversation is now firmly on the table. And the last thing, the thing I'd like to end up with is that looking at the rising generations, at the young people, we are seeing a really strong support for this work. And again, we're seeing young women as key spokespeople that are emerging. So from Greta Thunberg, who was already spoken about by Ulku, whose foundation supported our work in helping support the legal developments, but also more recently at the Conference of Youth in Glasgow, ecocide emerged as an explicit demand. In the Youth Environment Assembly for UNEA, and particularly driven by the Youth Task Force for the conference coming up in Stockholm in June, Stockholm Plus 50, also included ecocide as a key demand to the Assembly. And then bringing right up to date to the Commission on the Status of Women session that we're forming part of with this event, the UK's Youth Caucus for the CSW'66 calls specifically for ecocide. And what they say is, we call for accountability of all companies that cause environmental damage with the implementation of tougher legislation aimed at those who continue to gain profit at the expense of environmental welfare. And all private and public sector entities must improve their inclusivity of women and girls in decision-making protocols, so the voice of those they're affecting worldwide is heard at the decision-making table. And they talk about our organisation campaigning for the Rome Statute of the ICC to be amended for a 5th edition of ecocide, and they believe that campaigning and supporting this will significantly contribute to combating climate change, as severe environmental harm will become liable to criminal prosecution. And this landmark amendment would encourage greater recognition for climate change and enforce the right actions to become commonplace in all areas of business and industry. And I just end with the thought about using this very simple short definition that I showed you earlier, and I will pop the link to it in the chat as well, is using that definition as a kind of a lens to approach government decision-making, but also corporate decision-making and civil decision-making. Could be a really interesting exercise and really help to channel all of the action that's being called for in that latest IPCC report, and that collaboration between government and civil society and the private sector, having a framework with which to do that could really make a huge difference. And actually, there's something about having clear limitations in place that enables the creativity and the kind of innovation and new ways of approaching things, and perhaps I hope more women involved in the ways of approaching things. And I think that's really going to be a way forward in terms of the galvanization of global action. And I think what we see in the world is a sort of industrial, I suppose one might call it an industrial inertia. If not channeled in a particular direction, there is a sort of default tendency to continue with business as usual. And so we believe that this criminal parameter could actually make a fundamental difference to not just the how fast people are taking action, but to actually the nature of those actions in future. So thank you. And I realize that this is not my normal forum. I'm often speaking with lawyers and politicians and sometimes environmental specific NGOs. So this context for me of the Commission on the Status of Women has been absolutely fascinating. And I hope that some joining threads at least have become evident in what I've said. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your valuable speech. Actually, it was fascinating for us to listen to you, to listening you. And I would like to emphasize some points of your speech. First of all, ecocide is a relatively new term for me, and I think it's really important, especially for women activism in climate change. And it's a pleasure for me to see that there are some women-led organizations working on ecocide and ecocide law, like your organization. And we have some lawyers from Hazar. If they would like to speak, please speak. And I want to emphasize another point of your speech. It was a lovely conversation with you and your daughter. It was a lovely experience, I think, saying that if they are poisoning the ground, they are poisoning themselves. Yes, that's it. Actually, sometimes I believe that governments should stop thinking about their profits, their big decisions, and think like a child. Start thinking like a child, because that's it. If we are poisoning to the ground, we are poisoning ourselves and our children's future. That's it. And I believe that was a lovely conversation. Thank you for your speech. I believe that we can move on to the questions. I see some questions from chat, but if you would like to ask face-to-face by talking, please open your microphones and speak. You can ask questions for both Ülkü Hanım and Jojo. And for now, I have questions for Jojo. Terry asks, can you share the definition of ecocide again? And please show the card again.
Yeah, absolutely. So ecocide means, so let's see if you might be able to see it there. Ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with the knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. So I will put the link to it in the chat so that you can get more detail if you would like to. That's the core of the definition. There's another paragraph that explains the terms, and there are also translations into a few languages. So I'm going to pop that link there. There we go. That's gone into the chat.
Thank you. I think this will be beneficial for all of us, and I'm gonna check it out later. Thank you. Would you like to add something, or can I move to the other question?
No, please. Let's take more questions.
Okay, thank you. Büşra Balat asks, Is there any initiative to hold men committing harmful acts accountable in front of an international mechanisms? She's asking you, Jojo.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's really the key drive of this movement, is to create an international crime, which means that even heads of state could be held accountable at the International Criminal Court for serious damage to the environment. But also, as I said earlier, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, allows for complementary prosecutions in its member states. So effectively, any country which ratifies that crime would then be able to prosecute that crime in their own domestic legislation. So it wouldn't be dependent on the International Criminal Court itself. It would create the much broader possibility of prosecution in member states. And I think perhaps a very brief additional word about that definition is it's interestingly balanced, because it both covers the threat of severe harm. And of course, if you're going for an international crime, it does need to be severe harm. But also balancing this with the acts must be either unlawful or wanton. I'm on a conference now. And that means that it meshes in with existing law. So it acknowledges the fact that there are bodies of law that are different in different jurisdictions. So effectively, it will strengthen the existing body of environmental law. So if someone's in breach of that and they're creating serious damage, or they threaten to create serious damage, that is part of the crime. But it also goes a bit further and says if it's wanton, so even if an activity is permitted, if the destruction is disproportionately severe, then that will also fall under this definition. So it's a well-balanced definition, which we believe is why it's been quite well received in the political world. But it also draws forward everyone who I imagine is here in this room, but anyone who's working on the improvement of regulation that relates to the environment. Every detail of improvement will strengthen this law, because obviously the more things that become unlawful, the more effective this definition becomes.
Thank you. I think there are no more questions from chats. And do you have any questions? Do you want to add something? Terry, you can speak. You can open your microphone.
Sure, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to participate in this rich discussion on the eco-environment. I do want to ask Jojo a question, and also thank you to Ulu for her presentation on the women who are leading the charge in this space. But my question to Jojo is around the SIDS and the small island developing states and those Pacific islands who don't have time to wait. The policies that must be in place right now. There are countries that are literally sinking into the ocean right as we speak. And so we don't have time for legislators and others to be comfortable with the rhetoric in as it pertains to the ecosystem that we're working with. We just really have run out of time, and we need to be more aggressive and assertive in implementing solutions, because people are literally losing their livelihoods, their lives, their spaces to exist, and we are sitting back and waiting for policy and legislation. And I just wanted to hear your comments on that. Thank you.
Absolutely. And my goodness, I completely relate to this. And indeed, the most vocal states around this discussion are precisely the Pacific Island states that are seeing this as an existential threat. And they're actually, they've been the first to, in fact, our event in December was co-hosted by Samoa, Vanuatu, and Bangladesh, 3 of the world's most climate vulnerable countries, because they can see that this is a really important thing to move forward as fast as we can. Now, of course, what we have to bear in mind is that this is one of many possible tracks, but it's a really, really key one. And I think one of the reasons that is sometimes it's easy to miss if we concentrate on having the law in place. The power of this, I mean, when we look at possible it is to add an extra crime to the Rome Statute. This has happened before. The crime of aggression was added. Now, that took 7 to 10 years. We imagine that this will be a lot faster, partly because we have a changed climate literally in the world, but we'll also, as a result, we have a changed political climate. But also, it will take probably between 3 to 5 years. And I completely understand the response that we have from a number of people of, well, that's not fast enough. Now, changing international law is not a hugely fast thing to do, but I would say that it's not that we don't have time to do this, is that we don't have time not to do this. We must do this alongside everything else that we're doing, because what this will create is a framework that will actually deter and prevent the things that, the industrial kind of business as usual extremes that we're currently experiencing. So absolutely, I'm totally with you. There are many tracks that need to be followed instantly and policies that need to be moved as fast as possible. But one of the issues that we have is that those in those key, those large corporations who will simply continue what they're doing unless forced to do something else. For the sake of creating that boundary, we really must continue with this drive. And actually what we're aiming for this year, and obviously it'd be wonderful if Trinidad and Tobago and if other Caribbean states and Pacific states would be willing to actually come together and put forward an initial proposal, for example, based on this definition, which is an easy starting point. Actually putting a proposal on the table at the ICC is exactly the first step that's needed. Because what that does is it flags up to all the other states instantly, because it has to be submitted to the UN Secretary General, who then has to alert all the member states. So we don't have to, as you eloquently put it, we don't have to sit back and wait for that to happen. We can actually, push that happening. And actually, if you look at how far and how fast this movement has come in the last year and a half, you'll realize that actually it actually really is possible. But my last point around that would be that it's also very important for both governments and the corporate sector and civil society to see this coming. And that's really important, because actually the space between this moment now, with us speaking right here, and the moment that the law is adopted and ratified, is actually a really important space, because that is the point where, and we're already having this with, the investment community saying, oh, this is coming. We're going to need to think about this. We've had the Institute of Directors say to us, okay, we need to be telling our boards about this, because they're going to have to take this into account with all the decisions that they start to make, not just from then, but from now. Because actually, once that comes into place, it will start, it's not a retroactive law. So it's not like it will punish the people who are currently misbehaving, but it will do at that point, which means that the fact that they see it coming means that they have, it won't be a big window, but it needs to be some kind of window for them to actually adjust their practices. So the actual strategies and decisions that are made, we're already seeing, just because this definition is in existence, we're already seeing people making different decisions. We actually had an anecdotal example from South America recently, where a couple of mining companies were in conversation with a lawyer, an environmental lawyer, who was attempting to get agreement on how they would, behave in terms of the environmental considerations of what they were doing. And they were reluctant to sign what she was asking them to sign. What she then said was, have you seen the definition of ecocide that is coming, that is going to be coming? And they said no. And when she showed them the definition, they signed the documents she needed them to sign. Yeah. So there is some very on the ground examples now of how the fact that this is approaching is making a difference.
Yeah. Thank you for that. If I may, with a quick follow-up, I do appreciate that intervention you just made, and just would say that if the last 2 years have taught us nothing, meaning COVID, the onset of COVID-19, is that we all as a society, as a world, have to learn to pivot very quickly to adopt and adapt new ways of existing if we want to continue to exist on this earth. So I appreciate your sharing all the information you've shared, and it's been a very thought-provoking time listening to you. Thank you for that. And,
thank you.
And thank you for your host as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I couldn't agree more. I think if COVID has taught us anything, it's that when governments say, oh, well, it's going to take too long to do that, we actually just need to say to them, no, you need to get on board, because we've seen that you can act fast when you need to.
Thank you for your question and answer. I think that there is no more question, but I have a question for Ülke Hanım about the leadership, women leadership in private sector. Do you think that can we change the devastating effects of climate change by increasing women's leadership in private sector? Because we all know that the influence of private sector is crucial for developing some eco-friendly policies within the companies and the companies in general. And do you think that can we change the world? Can we change the devastating effects of climate change by increasing women's leadership in a private sector?
Exactly, Zeynep Hanım. Because at the private sector, since I've worked long years at the private sector, basically, at the moment, women representation in the top management level can be easily seen, and most of the women actually works directly with the CEO. And with the new trends, sustainability is very important. After EU Green Deal, really the companies in Turkey also very sensitive on the sustainability issues, and very rapidly they started to develop their programs. And as I observe from the companies at the private sector, the top management takes this very at the highest level. And as I also observe from at least for the Turkish market, I can say, especially for the sustainability related works are carried mostly by women. And they have really a good influence on the management and the company's strategies on sustainability, embedding this within the corporate's own strategy. It becomes the culture of the companies at the private sector. So it's, it is step by step. With the companies, we go up the national level, and then we go at the regional level and the global level. So it's very connected to each other. So women leadership on this is very important, and it pushes up, really lifting up to the appropriate levels. But it will take time for sure, but I'm not that much pessimist on this, seeing the progress on the private sector.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, because I read some research and they show that there's a positive correlation between women's leadership and eco-friendly company policies. And of course, it affects the decrease of climate change and the devastating effects of climate change, especially in private sector. And I'm happy to hear that you're optimistic about women's leadership in private sectors in terms of climate change policies and eco-friendly policies. Thank you so much for your attendance, your time, and your answers to all of the questions. For now, I would like to read some suggestions coming from our participants. Aslı Öztürk says that, thank you for Jojo to indicate us that just we need these new ground rules for Earth. Nature paradigm is changing. Eco-activism is so important for all rights. And Büşra Balat says, by the way, thank you for these inspiring presentations. And Terry says, thank you for hosting this discussion. Thank you for your attendance. Do you have any suggestions, any questions to our speakers? Aslı Öztürk says, you really gave us a way to struggle, Jojo. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ülke Hanım, for your speech. Thank you all for your attendance to this lovely event, for your questions. And especially I would like to thank you to our speakers for being with us today and for their lovely presentation speech. This is the end of our event. If you don't have any questions or suggestions.
I just want to express my gratitude once again for having me here, for your fantastic moderation, Zeynep, and also just for the fact that you're hosting this in English. And I realize that there are probably many on this call for whom English is a second language. And I'm just completely bowled over by how brilliant everybody is. It's wonderful.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to me to be with you here. And thank you again for your attendance, for your time and your fantastic speech and answers. Ülkü Hanım, do you have something to say? Would you like to share your opinions with us?
Actually, it was really very nice for me to be in that platform. So I'm very happy to be here. So thank you very much for this very kind invitation. So we'll keep in touch. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for your attendance. Actually, it was a lovely speech from you. Actually, I was very interested about your speech about private sector because I'm in the civil society and I'm a bit familiar with civil actions, ecofeminism, a bit of ecocide and ecocide law, but I was really away from a private sector and it was really important for me to listen from you. Thank you again. And thank you, our people here from Hazar Derneği, from UK, from US, from all around the world, from different NGOs, different companies. Thank you for your attendance and see you soon. See you at the other events of CSW'66. I'm sharing the official website of CSW. If you want to look around other parallel events or main events, you can check them from this website. Thank you again for all your attendance. See you. Have a nice day. Have a nice evening. Have a nice good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.